Hello, this video is going to review the Medical Assisting Clinical Manual. It's incredibly important to review this manual before inquiring with medical offices about working with them so that you understand what you're asking for and are able to answer some questions they'll surely have. You also want to make sure to thoroughly review this manual before you start your clinical rotations, as this manual outlines the guidelines, policies, and procedures that you are held responsible for complying with throughout the duration of your clinical rotations. You'll see that there is a table of contents at the beginning, and we're going to go through each of these sections. The clinical rotations are where you're able to apply what you've learned in your online classroom in a real-world setting. Students are responsible for securing their own clinical site and should expect being available standard daytime business hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, as this is typically when medical offices are open, which is the standard location for placement for a medical assisting student. You'll also see here the qualifications you must meet before beginning your rotations, including your prerequisite courses, good academic and behavioral standing with the university. You must have a signed contract submitted 2 months prior to the start date of your clinical rotations, which is 2 months prior to the start date of your clinical procedures class. The clinical lecture course typically precedes the clinical procedures class. You also must submit your requirements for Kaiser University that do entail some out-of-pocket expenses. These also must be submitted 2 months prior to the start date of your clinical procedures class. You should be prepared to purchase scrubs, stethoscopes, and the supplies that you'll need for your profession. Also note that if you select a clinical site that requires onboarding requirements above and beyond Kaiser's, you'll be responsible for providing those both to the clinical site and to our university. Next, the manual reviews the clinical courses. There are 4 in total. The first clinical class, clinical lecture, does not require clinical hours. It's entirely online. The 3 remaining clinical classes do require time spent at a clinical site with the completion of clinical hours and the completion of skills. Your clinical procedures class and your lab procedures class are what we refer to as the preceptorship courses, and the passing requirements are the same for both classes. A course grade of 70% or greater, submission of the medical assisting clinical skills rotation form with a minimum of 70% of the skills completion from the overall skills listed, with no less than 50% from each competency area. We'll take a look at this skills form in a moment. And you must submit 10 hours a week each week of the class for both classes. The externship requires the 70% grade completion, the skills rotation form completion, as well as the externship completion form and externship site evaluation form. The real notable difference here is the hours. Instead of working 10 hours a week for the 4 weeks of the class, you'll be working 40 hours a week for the 4 weeks of this class, and the hours are outlined here. In terms of grades, you do have some classes that will require a 65% pass rate. However, you also have classes that require passing with a 70% or greater to meet the requirement to enter into your clinical rotations. In terms of site eligibility, one of the core considerations will be whether or not that site is feasible for you in terms of transportation and whether they offer the hours necessary for the class and to meet your own personal schedule. The other consideration will be whether or not they can meet the skills requirements that I just mentioned from your MA Clinical Rotation Skills form. This is something that you'll want to discuss with the potential clinical site during the interview process. In terms of preceptorship qualifications, anyone who's qualified to perform the skill can oversee your work at the office. In terms of searching for a clinical site, our MA resources page does have a lot of tools, resources, and in terms of searching for a clinical site, you'll find a lot of resources and a step-by-step guide on how to go about this process on our MA resources page. Here you can find some additional information, including a suggestion as to what you might say if you're inquiring about placement over the phone. When you do reach out, make sure that you're being conscientious and considerate of the office. You certainly want to follow up with phone calls if they have not been returned, but you also want to be mindful of the timeline of that. Any offices that are interested in working with you must be provided with the facility packet in Appendix B. It's important that your medical office fully understands what they are agreeing to, which is why that facility packet must be provided. We do have very stringent requirements here. It's important that you read through these in detail, particularly making sure that you're responding to our department communication within 24 hours. So it's important to make sure that your voicemail is free and that we're able to leave messages, that you're checking your Kaiser email. This is important also if you're going to be making calls to clinical sites or inquiring and sending emails. You want to make sure that they're able to return that communication. Make sure to read through these policies in detail. We also have a very specific dress code policy. Please make sure that you're reading through this to follow this guideline when you're at your clinical rotations. You're not permitted to have your cell phone out during your clinical rotations unless approved for professional purposes. Your attendance policy pertains to your attendance in your classroom as well as at your clinical site. Your classroom requires that you submit work in your online classroom at least every 3 days. Your schedule with your clinical site should be agreed upon in advance, and you should be adhering to that schedule strictly. If any emergencies come up, you must notify both your clinical site in advance as well as Kaiser University at the email indicated on your paperwork. It's important to note that failure to comply with these policies can result in dismissal from the program or the university. If you have any questions about these, please make sure to reach out prior to your clinical rotations. This manual also reviews some technical standards for the clinical rotations. It outlines the policy on exposure to bloodborne pathogens or infectious diseases. You'll be taking a training on this as well, as it's one of the onboarding requirements. We also have a substance abuse policy you should read through. We do have a very stringent medical record confidentiality policy. You should not be sharing any information outside of your clinical rotations. You are also not permitted to post any pictures or information from your clinicals to any social media accounts. Any fabrication or falsification of information will result in being dismissed from the program and/or the university. Any performance or behavioral issues during your clinical rotations as reported by your clinical site will result in an action plan where we identify a pathway for moving forward if appropriate, which must be signed by the university and the student. We have an addendum identifying face covering policies. Appendix A is a policy agreement signature page. This is something that you will need to sign and submit prior to the start date of your clinical rotations. And then we find Appendix B. This is the facility packet that, again, you want to make sure you provide to any office that's interested or considering working with you for your clinical rotations. You want to make sure to print this portion of the manual only to provide to your clinical site. The previous section that we just went through is for you as the student. From this page forward is addressed to your clinical site. It outlines the expectations of the clinical rotations. It identifies important information about the program. It will outline the qualifying factors for students for the clinical site. And it also outlines the hours for each course. So you do have this as a reference. You'll also see the timesheet. This timesheet must be completed, signed by the student and the site supervisor every week and submitted to the email shown as well as to your online classroom. The clinical rotation skills form, sometimes referred to as the skill sheet, outlines the expected skills that you'll be able to cover during your clinical rotations. And again, these skills are based on an outpatient setting, such as a physician's office. That's going to be the best place to meet these skills. This is a 2-page skills form that outlines all of the skills you might encounter while working in an office. And as outlined here at the beginning, students must obtain a rating of 3 or higher on at least 70% of the total skills listed, with no less than 50% of the clinical skills from each competency area. So you need at least 50% of the clinical competencies, at least 50% of the administrative competencies, at least 50% of the professionalism and ethical competencies, 50% of the medical law competencies, and 50% of the effective communication patient interaction competencies. So while you only need to meet 50% from each area, you still need to meet 70% from the overall checklist. There are approximately 36 skills on this list, which means you need a total of about 25 skills overall, making sure that you're representing skills from each of those clinical competency areas. So just as an example, let's say your office is only able to accommodate 50% of the clinical competencies, 50% of the administrative competencies, but 100% of the competencies on the second page. This would qualify you to complete the course by meeting that 70% overall with at least 50% from each competency area. This skills form is going to be submitted to the email shown as well as to your online classroom. You will use this same skills form for each of your 3 clinical classes, with the idea that you're improving in your performance each class and ideally also addressing new skills in each class. Upon the completion of the entire rotation, your clinical site will fill out the externship completion form, and you, the student, will submit the externship site evaluation form. The next section of this facility packet is the contract. Your clinical contract will require that you complete all of the information indicated throughout the form. This is a short 4-page contract. You, as the student, and your site, which will be your agency representative, will need to sign and date on 3 of these 4 pages. Information and signatures are required on page 1. Signatures are required on page 3, and information and signatures are required on page 4. We are looking for your start date, and this start date should be week 1 of your clinical procedures class. It doesn't necessarily need to be Monday, but it should be during the first week of your clinical procedures class. And again, that is going to be sent to the email shown here no less than 2 months prior to the start date of your clinical rotations. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to either your clinical advisor or the MA department at 1-888-4-KAISER.